This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. Learning takes place at all stages of one's life. However, one may need to be made aware that learning occurs continuously. It is advisable to define and describe learning to understand it. Psychologists like Jean Piaget, Howard Gardner, Lev Vygotsky, and Burrhus Frederick Skinner and Albert Bandura have extensively studied the different ways in which learning takes place. Other researchers from different fields have also concentrated on understanding underlying concepts that allow learning to take place. This article explores the concept of learning by focusing on learning, the role of behavior in learning, types of learning, and the relationship between learning and cognition. A definition of learning. The known definition of learning involves a process that results in a relatively permanent behavior change based on an individual's interactional experience with its environment. Hence, learning is a significant process that defines an individual's adaptation. The central assumption associated with learning psychology is that factors like the environment, reinforcement, and other interventions offer the best conditions for understanding human behavior and learning. Learning has relatively long-term changes in behaviors. Hence, learning does not result from fatigue, and it does not result from physique changes that occur due to aging and development. It isn't easy to separate an individual's learning processes and the environment. This makes learning to be a form of biological adaptation. Learning leads to behavioral changes which are unique to a person. It only takes place within one's lifespan and originates from environmental experiences. One can note the importance of the environment and an individual's interactions with it. The environment is responsible for changes in behaviors that lead to learning. At the same time, behaviors also exert their influences on the environment. Psychologists note that adaptation to the environment and learning to adapt result from the need to survive and find comfort. Behavior changes reflect that learning has taken place due to interactions with the environment. The role of behavior in learning. Behavioral changes take place in an individual during the process of learning. Behavioral changes reflect one's adaptation to the environment during a lifespan. This is an effort to survive in the environment. Psychologists have observed that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. This shows that behavior is flexible and does not have any relationship with an individual's genetic composition. Some changes may not necessarily reflect learning. These are usually temporary situations, e.g., fatigue, motivation, injuries, and diseases, among others associated with certain conditions. They may change one's behavior, but they do not reflect learning. One's experiences, which lead to learned behaviors, may persist throughout his or her life. On the other hand, learned behaviors may also fail to manifest themselves throughout one's life. Sometimes, it is easier to prove that learning has occurred later. This suggests that behaviors that may indicate that learning has taken place may not manifest themselves until a situation warrants them. Hence, one may react to the environmental condition to show that learning has occurred. Reinforcement of behaviors has a critical impact on learning outcomes. Reinforcement aims to enhance the chances of a response taking place again. One can observe and identify responses when learning occurs. However, some responses, like fast heartbeats, are internal, i.e., they occur within the body. Two different types of learning. Classical conditioning learning depends on what takes place before one responds to a situation. Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning is a learning process that takes place through associations between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. Pavlov's concept of learning involves using a neutral stimulus and natural reflex. In his classical study that involved a dog, Pavlov used sound as a neutral signal while salivating in the dog because the food acted as a naturally occurring reflex. Pavlov concluded that when one associated the neutral stimulus, tone, with the environmental stimulus, food, the sound of the tone alone could produce the salivation response. People apply classical conditioning in training pets and animals. Operant conditioning depends on the results of responses. In this learning process, whether or not one may repeat a certain behavior depends on the reinforcement, punishment, or a lack of consequences. All species demonstrate some forms of operant conditioning in behaviors. Operant conditioning has influenced several aspects of psychology. For instance, operant conditioning is effective in changing the behaviors of children. One must actively participate in operant conditioning to learn the behavior. A response may reinforce or discourage a behavior. For instance, positive responses may facilitate the repeat of the same behavior, while negative responses may discourage it. The relationship between learning and cognition. Learning requires the mental elements of an individual. Learning processes require the involvement of cognitive processes and other mental activities. Psychologists have used cognitive processes in relation to stimuli and responses in order to explain learning theories. The relationship between learning and cognition is that cognitive activities result in certain outcomes, which may change or result in some behaviors. Learning results from training, conditioning, and repetitive habits. The consequences of these activities depend on the cognitive abilities of an individual. For instance, a person may be able to associate a dog with fierceness after experiencing an attack from a dog. The person learns to associate fierceness with a dog. When the person sees the dog, the sight of the dog reinforces his or her cognitive experiences. The person may learn to associate all dogs with fierceness. However, one may learn that not all dogs are fierce over time. A lack of cognitive relationships may make the learning process to be reflexive and associative. Learning aspects like conditioning, habits, and training, among others, require cognitive elements. Overall, one's learning involves cognitive elements. Cognitive accounts for understanding and knowing an individual when he or she relies on cognitive processes for learning. Cognitive learning covers aspects of thinking, memory, and other abilities beyond basic training and conditioning. Conclusion. One can examine relatively permanent changes in behaviors that occur in learning processes. In this context, behaviors act as sources of information that one can use for verifiable learning. Classical and operant conditioning demonstrate the relationship between learning and cognitive processes. The relationship is interrelated and aids organisms in their attempts to survive and adapt to their environments. Understanding learning processes cannot occur without involving aspects of cognitive activities. Psychologists have used these associations to understand normal and adaptive processes in learning and prevent what could be abnormal or maladaptive in people. This essay on psychological concept of learning was written and submitted by a student just like you. The IvyPanda Samples database hosts thousands of works similar to this one on various subjects. Visit ivypanda.com to find what you are looking for, free of charge.